Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Eddie Pate and Jonathan Stutz, authors of a new book titled Daily Practices of Inclusive Leaders, a guide to building a culture of belonging, which releases on May 28th. Eddie Pate is the founder and chief inclusion, diversity, and equity officer of Eddie Pate Speaking and Consulting. He has spent over 23 years doing inclusion and diversity work in the corporate world, leading those efforts at places such as Amazon, Starbucks, and Microsoft. Jonathan Stutz is the founder and president of Global Diversity Partners. He has over 25 years experience working in leading edge companies such as Amazon, Microsoft, and Zulily. Jonathan serves on the board of Youth Eastside Services, a nonprofit for youth and families supporting behavioral health and substance issues in Bellevue, Washington. You can learn more about the new book at bkconnection.com and at inclusivepebbles.com. So guys, congratulations on all of your wonderful work, and thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Oh, Brian, thank you very much.
So
Wonderful.
yeah, so no, it's my pleasure. I was really excited when I heard about, the topic of your book and kind of the, way that it's oriented. Um, but before we get into that, I mean, maybe you could tell folks, each of you, a little bit about yourselves beyond, what I briefly touched on.
Sure. Go ahead, Eddie.
All right, sure. So I think the best thing for your audience to know is I've done 24 years plus of inclusion, diversity, and equity work, and that's really all that I've wanted to do. I currently live north of Seattle in a place called Shoreline, Washington. So I'm on the West Coast. Moved up here back in '93 to actually go to grad school, where I had got my doctorate from the University of Washington in sociology, comparative race and ethnic relations. I've been married for 37 years. I have two wonderful kids, a daughter who's 31 and works at Amazon, and a son who's 25 and is a junior software engineer for a company called RevTech. His name is Arthur. Her name is Carly. I have a Chihuahua named Fanny. So,
There you go.
and it's like almost like we're speed dating, Brian. It's like I love photography and outdoors and nature and all that kind of stuff, which is true. And so, and love working out. I'm an old athlete who is, not as athletic as he once was, but still tries. So that's enough about me. Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Eddie. Yeah. I was born in Toronto, Canada, which has been considered one of the most diverse cities in the world. At a young age, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia during the height of the civil rights movement.
Mm.
And that experience affected me deeply for the experiences I had as a young boy living in the South during that time. Saw a lot of discrimination, anti-Semitism, racism as a young kid that influenced me and affected me years later. I'm married 42 years, coming up on the next one soon. I have two adult children as well. I have a daughter, Katie, who is a oncology breast surgeon, and she is just coming out of a fellowship to start practice this summer. And my youngest daughter, Jacqueline, is a data science manager for the company's technology that we're on right now, Zoom.
Mm.
So we're feeding her a paycheck, I guess.
There you go.
And I have an English cream golden retriever named Simon, who is the sparkle in my eye right now. And I'm an active runner. I've run probably 15 plus half marathons. I'm a hiker. I'm very active in the community, as you mentioned, with Youth Eastside Services. I've served on the Human Services Commission for two different cities in which I've lived for a total of over 15 years, I guess, between the two of them. And yeah, and just love the work I'm doing. I call myself soft retired. Left corporate life in October 20 and opened up this small boutique training consulting practice similar to Eddie has done at around the same time.
I need to use that term. That's a really good way to describe,
Soft,
I think, what I'm
soft retired.
do. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
that term goes to the credit of George Campbell, a guy we used to work with who gave me that term, and I told him I was going to use it, and I've given it to other folks as well. It's a great term.
Well, you guys have both got wonderful backgrounds, and it sounds like wonderful families. And Jonathan, you have to thank your Zoom daughter for me because, that's basically what got me through the pandemic was, be able to use that tool that works so well, so better than other previous, webinar and video conferencing desktop tools that I'd used in the past. So I'm very thankful for that.
You and
Oh,
about
no.
50 million billion people
Isn't that
across the
the
planet who
truth? I
use
mean,
Zoom. Yeah,
isn't it
no doubt.
amazing when something catches on and becomes that
Yep.
pervasive?
Yeah, it
So,
certainly is.
so let's dive into the book. As I mentioned, the title is Daily Practices of Inclusive Leaders, a guide to building a culture of belonging. So can you tell us how that book came about?
Sure, I'm
Sure.
happy to share the story, and Eddie jump in at any time, of course. Um, well, so I had an idea, and I think Eddie had too. We love to write, and we both, for a long time had ambitions of being an author, writing our own book. For me, it came out of the specific content came out of a master's thesis that I had written in 2013, which focused on the idea that leadership, it was an organizational leadership master's, and it came out of the idea that leadership is about having courage, having heart, having wisdom, and having a vision for creating a culture of belonging, or having a shared goal among the team. And then Eddie and I talked extensively, during our time together, working together. We'll talk more about that later at Amazon, about when we retired, about writing and potentially writing a book on inclusive leadership, and tying a model that he designed over many years with marrying it with the master's thesis idea that I had had. And we reached out to a friend of ours who's also a Barrett Kohler author, Bill Price, and a close friend of mine. I've been running together for over 20 years. And so he's a personal friend, and he's written 3 books on customer service. His first one was called "The Best Service Is No Service," and which is a great customer service title. And we asked him he'd written a book with a co-author, and we asked him, like, do you recommend writing a book with somebody else? Because we know that it's like a marriage, as I mentioned, it can be tough. And he says, yeah, we were all told not to do it. It's horrible. It's very difficult on a relationship. Don't do it. But he did it anyway, and he did it 3 times. And yeah, I mean, it's been a emotional, personal experience. It's like putting a wedding together, where you have each family has their idea of what the wedding should look like, right? And so, but we did it, and then Bill introduced. He liked the idea of our book, and he introduced us to Neil Mallet at Barrett Kohler, and we pitched the book to him. And it's not easy. I mean, it took 4 months and a 27-page proposal to get a contract, because we went back and forth multiple times, and to get it honed down to, there's a lot of books on ID&E. We call it inclusion, diversity, and equity. We can talk about why we do that later. And then, what are we going to do that's different? And so they really wanted to know what was special about our approach. And so that's what it took to get down to. And then here we are. Last April, we signed a contract, got it written, and basically between then and August for the manuscript. And here we are today, about 6 weeks out from the book hitting the streets.
Mm.
Yeah, and what I would add too, and that compressed time frame, was to make sure that the book launches before the election cycle takes over everything. So, within that process, we had an even more compressed time frame to get this book written. And you have what's interesting, Brian, is you have 2 distinct voices that needed to be merged into one voice, that we would be able to get our ideas across. And we're very fortunate in some of the support that we've gotten, through BK Publishing, and particularly a woman named Danielle Goodman, who helped us as an editor, an organizer of text, and merging of voices. So because of the support that we've gotten from a whole bunch of people, we are able to manage that compressed time frame. I think get out a book that hopefully will be well received and be meaningful and have an impact.
Well, most of the authors that I deal with, write single author books, but
Right.
I've interviewed several pairs, that have co-written a book, and I've gotten the impression that they've all gone really well. So if you get good people together that are willing to work together, I think just like any other partnership, it can happen quite well.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I think part of what the advantage, and Jonathan joked and alluded to the emotional piece of writing a book together. But I think the advantage that we had is that we have worked together over the last now it's like 5 years ago, and we worked for several years together at Amazon, and we were on the same page in terms of how we thought about the topic, the importance of it, the meaning of it, both of our roles in it, right? Because we come from very distinct, Jonathan's a white, Jewish male, and I'm, self-identified, black, biracial, but identifies black, African American male, and just I think the beauty of understanding where each of us comes from and understanding the work that we had to deliver at Amazon together, I think was really a big part of why the book landed where it landed, if that makes sense.
Very cool. Very cool. So there's been quite a bit of ebb and flow over the last few years relative to support for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and within corporate environments as part of that. Can you describe kind of where things stand now?
Sure, I'll jump in, then Jonathan jump in too as well, please. It's really interesting, and Brian, as we've talked about in our prep call, I mean, I loved your questions, and this is one of the questions that really stood out for me because it's so meaningful, important now to have this dialogue about where ID&E is as a function, as a philosophy, as a perspective in this country, probably globally. And I would say the best way to think about where ID&E is right now is it's under attack. And it is under attack from, I believe, my perspective, from people who are very far right in their perspectives and thinking that this is something that only benefits Black people and women at the extent of it, right? And not really looking at the notion behind inclusion, diversity, and equity is for everyone to benefit. And in fact, if we do ID&E work right, it's not a zero-sum game. It is, the pie gets larger for everyone, and we are more effective and innovative and creative. So we're I'd say where the industry right now is we have a bunch of companies full steam ahead and ignoring the contention that's out there. We have companies that are not sure what to do and are pulling back and are stalled and are kind of teetering a little bit. And then you have some companies that are abandoning it totally.
Wow.
But I'm encouraged to know that from some of the reports that I've seen and some of the data I've seen and some of the stories I've seen and some of the actual literally dialogues that Jonathan and I have had with other diversity professionals, ID&E professionals, is that the majority of companies are still full steam ahead. And they're trying to figure out how best to address the attacks that are coming and how to make sure that they keep leadership and those who control budgets and resources and directions of companies stay the course, because it is a valuable one. So, I mean, that's kind of the big picture answer of where we are now. I love where we were as an industry before these attacks started happening, is that we've evolved from just talking about it being about diversity, and we've really evolved to the discussion being about an integrated inclusion and about equity as the end game, and making sure that all our practices are truly benefiting those groups that we want them to, equitably across multiple dimensions, not just race or gender, identity, veteran status, people with disabilities, right? People who are globally different. So that's kind of where I think the industry is. Jonathan, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I would add that the narrative has really been hijacked, Brian. And we need to grab it back because there's a lot of misinformation out there today about what inclusion, diversity, and equity is about. It's a business issue, and it's about creating high-performance teams, highly effective teams, where if you've ever been on a team that's that special, where you just feel connected to everybody, everybody feels seen, valued, heard, understood, they're firing on all cylinders. And that's that high performance team where, people have your back and you're listening to different perspectives. We're dealing with some of the most complex challenges and problems. Look at, AI today and how companies are grappling with it. We need all hands on deck, and we need everybody's ideas and perspectives. We need people to be able to share openly and be their authentic selves and share their lived experiences so that we can solve these tough problems. And if we have folks that feel that they are uh, undermined or not listened to, critiqued, knocked down, not heard, cut off, ideas being taken. If it's that kind of you know environment, then we're not going to achieve the goals that we need to see. Businesses aren't going to be profitable. You're not going to be able to succeed. So this idea that this is about helping Black people or helping, yeah, it's about creating a culture where everybody succeeds. And historically, many people have been underestimated and been marginalized and oppressed. So that we do want to recognize that. But it's also, this inclusion idea is very much about guys like me and you, Brian, white males. We have a role to play, and our role is to understand that privilege and status that we have received for no other reason other than we were born into it by dumb luck. We have been granted by society additional privilege and status and power. And so we can use that to actually create space for other people and hear those voices that we need to hear and just create that environment where everybody feels that they are, as I said, seen, heard, valued, and understood. But we have to recognize that position we have, and sometimes stand back and move to the aside to shine a light on other folks so they're heard and seen. So that's what I would add to it.
Well, I mean, for me, the whole area of IDE is basically the theory of our country, the founding theory of our country, right? Equity, right? All men and women and created equal, right? Everyone created equal. And, welcoming immigrants, right? And within the corporate world, obviously, you're trying to be as efficient as you possibly can. So why don't you design structures where that's the case? And, I've been in corporate America a lot of my life and was in some really positive, phenomenal, supportive team situations and some that were pretty much the polar opposite. And, it's really clear to me which one's more effective and which one's better. And, I think that with those kinds of goals that you guys described as the priority, of overall effectiveness, making everyone feel as effective as possible, period. End of story, right? I mean,
Right.
But
I would jump in, Brian, and say that the idea that we are all created equal is more of a vision statement.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's an aspire to, because in reality, we are not all created equal. It is
we all haven't ended up in environments that are equal either.
That's right.
As you said earlier, I mean, everything about the, ideals of our country are aspirational. No question.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think what I think Jonathan's getting at too is it's at least the way I interpret it, it's not that we weren't necessarily, all born equal, if you however you want to put it, but we have different pressures that we face because of who we are and where we live and how we look and all those different things that play a legitimate variable and factor in how successful we can be. So in order to actually live up to the ideals of everyone being, treated equally and given equal opportunity to be successful, we've got to come to the realization that there are dynamics in society and there are dynamics that we don't call upon ourselves that do influence whether you can be successful. You have access to different things. That's what we need to get people to understand, is to actually acknowledge their privilege, not just point at people's disadvantage. So people don't want to admit their advantage, but they will talk about the disadvantage that people have. And that actually, honestly, Brian, makes me laugh, where you'll have lots of men who will honestly, we've got to do something about the disadvantages women face. But the minute you say to them, but we should also address the advantage you have as being male or being white and male in place, and it's like, whoa, no, like privilege, I got mine. I'm here because I earned this, right? So so there's, I think, to Jonathan's point, there's a lot of work that we have to do to make people just acknowledge the reality of where we live, for us to actually get to that ideal state and that position that we want to get to in society, where everyone's contributing. And because of this, we are more innovative and creative in what we do, how we work, how we live, what we create, right? And that's the point of ID&E, to my point.
Very cool. Very cool. So next question is straight out of, I'm sure, your book proposal, where the publishers wanted to know who the target audience is. So who is this book most intended for?
Jonathan, go ahead.
Sure. So if you think about it, in this idea that I'm coming back to this idea of talking about creating high performance teams and creating an environment where everybody feels they belong, it's a culture of belonging. This is for leaders. This is, first and foremost for business leaders, the people that are people managers, they're leading people and teams and organizations. Certainly that's a primary audience for us. This is as much a business and a leadership book as it is a book about inclusion, diversity, and equity. The second piece of it is diversity professionals. Diversity professionals, people who are actually in the trenches, operationally, rubber meets the road, doing the work that we've been doing for 25 years. This is to help them. Eddie and I wanted to have a legacy and take all the knowledge and experience that we've been fortunate enough to have and all the leaders and mentors that have helped us. And frankly, the work that we've done is by standing on the shoulders of the people who've done the work before us. We've been very privileged to learn from them and benefit from their good work before us. So it is for those diversity professionals to hand back to them what, to pay it forward basically for what we've learned, so to make their jobs so maybe hopefully a little bit easier. The second one, or the third one, is the folks that are just passionate about it in the companies and organizations, nonprofits, people that are in what are called employee resource groups, in doing corporate social responsibility. Those folks that are in the organizations that are part of the employee base that's passionate about creating a culture where everybody feels that they fit in and that they belong and can achieve their goals.
Cool.
And the only thing I would add to that, Brian, is, and Jonathan and I were very specific about this too when we were writing the book. Our book, the target audience in terms of companies aren't just the big, massive companies that have all these resources for ID&E and have a diversity leader. They have, entrenched teams, strategies. It is for them for sure, right? And I think our book sets it up to where they could really leverage the daily practices that we do and effectively merge them into their structured processes and policies for how they do the work beautifully. But it's also, I think, super, one of our audiences are those companies that are smaller, that don't have the luxury or the resources to be able to hire ID&E teams and leads, and they're counting on their HR teams to drive this work, or they're counting on the passion of heroes. That's how we refer to it. People who are heroes within your organizations to drive the work, right? It gives them tools and daily practices they could use to drive things too. So there are certain audiences that Jonathan and I identified beautifully, but it's also structurally, it's good for big companies, small companies, nonprofit organizations, whatnot, who just have people who want to know how they can make a difference on a daily basis in a way that's not overwhelming or taxing.
Good, good. So, obviously with a very complex and nuanced, set of issues around this, how do you organize the book?
Right.
Want
Yeah.
to jump on? You want me to jump on? Go ahead.
I can grab it. It's great. Yeah. So really it's in two primary parts. The first part is really these foundational elements of inclusive leadership. So we start off with, why leaders are key to the daily practices of inclusion. And so we give people kind of like the why piece right up front. So you're, really understand why this is applicable to you. And then we go into the idea of, as I mentioned earlier, wisdom, courage, and heart. And this idea that on a daily basis, you can be practicing wisdom, which is tied to this 2IL model, the 7 insights of inclusive leadership that I mentioned earlier that has been developed over many years and used effectively. A lot of folks just quickly on that believe that, when you're doing diversity training, it's about unconscious bias. And what we show to them is, unconscious biases are really important to understand and how to interrupt those. But there's also 6 other elements that we bring in that we think are really important, such as cultural competency, stereotypes, micro advantages, micro inequities, being a tempered radical, and a few more. And then we talk about courage. Maya Angelou talked about, of all the virtues, the most important is courage. And so the courage to act is really key as a leader to create a speak up culture. And we talk about what that means. And then the other one is having heart, having empathy and compassion for folks. and being vulnerable as a leader, that when you become vulnerable as a leader and share the challenges that you face, people are drawn closer to you, and you demonstrating empathy for them helps them feel safe psychologically to be able to be their authentic self. So that's a critical one too. And then, as Eddie said, this book is as much for small businesses as it is large, as much for nonprofits as for profit. So we talk about a chapter called Structure and Accountability, where we say these are some of the, and you'll hear us talk later about the pebbles, and these are some of the bigger pebbles, more infrastructure pebbles to set up and being successful in this space. And that kind of takes care of part one. And then part two of the book is actually the meat of the book, the core of the book, which is the daily practices. And we've arranged them and we call it a guide because it is literally a book that you can have on your desktop, that you can have, dog-eared and have Post-it notes in it, because it follows the employee life cycle. So it goes through from, recruiting and hiring to developing talent, to how to retain the talent, how to keep people engaged, and then just everyday inclusion, things you can do every day. We talk about micro opportunities, and this is just simple things like walking down the hall and you look at somebody in the eye, and if you're even on the phone, you can nod your head and make eye contact, right? Or you can wave, just something to make people feel seen, that you're acknowledging them as a leader. So that's like a micro opportunity, right? And then we talk about this, and Eddie mentioned this earlier, that the importance of human resources. And because of the scaling of this work across, and oftentimes ID&E departments are under-resourced and underfunded in many ways, not just in budget, but in headcount, to be able to leverage human resources as a partner in leveraging them as a function in this work and helping them understand how they can help through their work, help us scale it across organizations. And then a huge chapter that I think is really going to be super valuable for folks is we've been doing this work, and I call it change management work at a bigger, 30,000 foot level. And I've been doing it in not just in the diversity space, but in operations work for Microsoft and Zulily, for example. So we talk about overcoming hurdles on your inclusive leadership journey. And these are really the tough challenges, the adversity you're going to face. And then we get into how to overcome them. So we leverage our experience to help people understand, like, not only are you going to face this, be ready for it, but here's how you can deal with it. Here's how you can overcome it. And so we think that's going to be a tool that's super valuable for folks. And then we close out the book with, challenge accepted. Here are some of the kind of critical pillars of this work that you want to take away from the book and remember and utilize as these principles that you can kind of keep on your corkboard and remember on a daily basis as well. And that kind of wraps up the book. Eddie, anything else you want to add that I missed?
No, I think that describes it beautifully, and very practical, that hands-on. And as Jonathan alluded to earlier, that's what we've heard over the years, as long as we've done this work, is I get this work, I understand why we do it, I understand the business case rationale, but what do I do? What do I do every day? And that really is what much of the book is about. And that's, I think that's one of the beauties of this book, is then people are going to be able to just get and use it and build on those wonderful principles they have from other strategies and thoughts and perspectives they have on ID&E, and then just use our framework to do what we want to do on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
The one thing I did forget that as you were speaking, I remember that we should point out is that the first five chapters, the foundational chapters, we start off each chapter with a profile of an inclusive leader that we have worked with. So we went out and interviewed 5 folks that we picked, 2 from small companies, 3 from larger companies, and interviewed them. And we give you an insight into how they lead as an inclusive leader specific to the chapter's content. So the leader that we profile on Heart, for example, Carletta Uten, talks about her level of compassion and empathy and how she developed that, for example. So that's a kind of a cool, very practical approach that we love. We're excited about, that we're able actually to give you a perfect example of somebody who exudes the traits and characteristics of that chapter's content.
I kind of assume
Jonathan,
you guys would have a lot of case studies. That would just make a whole lot of sense, given your backgrounds and the topics. So I'm glad to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, and Brian, it's not just only case studies, it's stories. And we had one of our folks who written an endorsement for us basically said it's like sitting in an office as a fly on the wall, listening to Jonathan and Eddie tell stories about their experiences. And that's what we really wanted to capture too. So yeah, it's absolutely right. And those stories do come out in those five leaders, which I think is beautifully done. But the last piece that I would add to the structure of this book, Jonathan, and I'm sure we could probably keep talking and finding things and adding things, but one of the things, Brian, that we did, which is interesting and different, is we've integrated QR codes throughout the book for people who are visual learners or are generationally different. And we would imagine Gen Z folks would be more apt to really want to scan a QR code, which will take them to a YouTube channel site that we have, and they actually can watch videos that give more information about what we're talking about in that particular section of the book. And it also is a real cool way to update resources as we go, and they automatically get updated, and we don't have to change the book. It changes the content that we have on our Inclusive Pebbles website. So I think we were trying to be really pretty smart about how the book was structured and the audiences that we were speaking to. And that, and we had a young person who gave us that idea. You should use QR codes because here's what you'll do. And we're just like, Jonathan and I are two boomers. And so that wasn't
That's
what
a
we were
great,
thinking about.
it's a great idea. I mean, in ebooks, the links, if it's spelled out, can be a hyperlink, right? But in a print
Right.
book, you can't have that.
Right.
So,
But you can have a QR code.
You just created your own active hyperlink, basically, which is
Yep.
awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool.
So I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here. One of the you've used a lot of great words, in the work that you've talked about, courage and wisdom and empathy and things like that. As I've matured and experienced, one of the concepts that I found to be increasingly important is trust. Partly because it takes into so many different facets. There's trust in character, there's trust in competence. How do you see that fitting into what you guys are advocating?
Yeah. Trust is a huge issue, and especially for people that have a history of trauma, and building an environment where people feel that they are trusted and they can be trusted, and they're given opportunity to take risk and be wrong without being criticized. The times that I've performed best is where I was allowed to make mistakes and trial and error. They call it in tech, they call it fast failure.
Yeah.
To learn from those mistakes. So one of the daily practices that we talk about in the book is about inclusive one-on-ones. And at the heart of the inclusive one-on-one is that relationship between the manager and the employee, or even employee to employee, and how they can build that trust by getting to know each other at a deeper level and spending the time to understand somebody's lived experience, and to not necessarily talk, but to listen and to be curious and inquisitive, to hear who they are and what they're about. And it could be other skills and experiences they've had at work, but it also can be things going on in their personal life. It doesn't have to be always about work. So I think that one-on-one that is overlooked as its opportunity for leaders to leverage to build connection and to build belonging is so important. And
Yep.
so one of the things that we arm wrestled a little bit about was how much we were going to spend in the book talking about these inclusive one-on-ones. And I'm very passionate about it. And because I felt like we needed to spend more time talking about the tips, and so we found a nice compromise, as we do. And it's in there, and people should read it. And some of them are obvious, but some of the language you put but sometimes we need a little nudge to get back to the fundamentals. So that's my take on the trust piece, that it's absolutely critical, Brian. You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, and I think what I would say with the trust piece, I think quite honestly, Brian, what we're trying to do with the entire book is create cultures of belonging. And I think core to cultures of belonging is a very strong measure of trust. And if you don't build trust in underestimated groups that you're trying to show them that they belong, that they have a voice, that they're going to be heard, that they're going to actually have the ability to have agency in how the organization runs. If you don't do that, you're not going to have trust, right? And they're not going to want to stay in the organization. So I would argue that the entire book is about how to help leaders and people and everyone know how to build trust in those underestimated communities and maybe overestimated communities. I don't know if that's the way you would say it or not, but and everybody that's involved with this. So if you want to create a culture of belonging, you've got to make trust be part of it. And each of the daily practices that we do, we're teaching people to use them in a way to signal to folks that they matter and that what they say is important and that they can trust us to live that. And so I think that's one big part of it. And I'm gonna go on just a slight little tangent because I want to make sure that we bring this up in how the book is effective. And I don't think we've done it at this point. And it has to do with the daily practices and what we talk about, which are the pebbles that we drop that cause ripples, that cause other people to drop pebbles, which cause ripples. And it could be aiming towards making someone feel like they are, they have trust or belonging. And it's the aggregation of all those pebbles that we drop that cause ripples that leads to cultural and organizational change, right? And so it is creating trust, building cultures of belonging, and all that are what we're saying can be done with just simple daily practices that cause ripples, that cause someone else to think about and see what you've done and do the same thing. And Brian, to wrap that into this, that's how you create trust. And that's the nature and the core of this book, is that you don't have to overwhelm yourself with changing everything you're doing. It may be a matter of simply reminding someone in a meeting that women are often cut off. And actually, why don't we wait and hear what she has to say, because it's valuable and important. Then we'll get right back to you and do it in a way that doesn't cause defensiveness, but makes it a learning moment for everyone. And then someone in the next meeting may do the same thing. And simply because you modeled it with a pebble that you drop, cause that ripple, cause someone else in another meeting to do that. And so you are building belongingness, you're building trust, you're building, the fact that, environments where people want to stay. So I think that's what
Good.
what else I would add to it.
But I love your answers to that question. That's great. So
Good question.
I'd like to get to another aspect that I guess you're asked about all the time. And this endorsement kind of points to it. This is from Dr. Deborah Meyerson, author of Tempered Radicals and professor at Stanford University. She says, Pate and Stutz provide compelling and useful daily practices that help leaders drive the impact so many find frustratingly elusive. They provide a roadmap for driving impact that starts small and grows into a remarkable force for change. So, can you talk a little bit about how companies can measure the impact of the steps that you're suggesting that they take?
Yeah, and that's look, great question. I'll jump on this, and Jonathan, please weigh into it for us as well. I think because our book is aligned across the life cycle of employees, and we are very purposefully teaching people how to use bigger pebbles and structures and accountabilities, but then also pebbles across how we hire, how we set up interview loops, how we create engagement opportunities so that people feel like that they belong in this organization. So every one of those aspects of the life cycle of the employee that we're teaching people to drop pebbles for are all measurable things, right? So, the same types of measures that people are using for, how engaged are employees. And as long as you're doing those engagement surveys disaggregated so you can see how do women feel relative to men? How do Black women feel relative to Asian women, to white women, to Indigenous women, to Hispanic or Latino women? See what I mean? So if you disaggregate the data, you are going to be able to see what kind of impact that you're having on how engaged someone feels based off of your normal assessment survey, right? So I think it's designed to be able to integrate into how you would normally use those processes for assessing someone's engagement, or looking at another example would be we talk in the book about creating candidate slating as a process, and we which is making sure that you have at least two underestimated groups per each interview, because research shows if you have two Black people or women or indigenous people or people with disabilities or veterans on an interview loop, they're not seen as a token, and that their chances of being hired and given access to the process is much higher. So that pebble right there is when you do your throughput data and you look at the data that you are measuring as a recruiting organization, you'll see an uptick in the number of underestimated groups that are hired in roles, helping you close the gaps that you might have. So if you see, so at every stop of the life cycle of an employee, the things that we talk about are going to impact how successful you can be in those processes, and that's really what we look at in what we've experienced as well. The companies just have to be willing to disaggregate data and look at how the impact of what we're talking about is impacting people differently, not just all men or all women, but how do you disaggregate it out to see it? And I think is the important piece, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Data is key. And we marry that with this idea of qualitative data as well. So you've got quantitative data, which is your demographic data intersected by all the different types of data you're collecting as an employee from employees, but also, roundtable discussions that you can have with groups, communities, employees to understand the experience they're having, executive interviews to understand how they're experiencing, or interviews with if you have a diversity team, interviews with HR, discussions, and culture surveys too. So you're tapping in and can get a baseline and then understand how the culture is changing over time by hearing from employees. And then even that data from the culture surveys is dissected by all the different data you're collecting, whether it's race, gender, ethnicity, veteran status, disability, all that. So you can see how different people are experiencing the organization. And from there, you can develop gap plans, kind of like where you are today and then where you want to be. What's your aspired to, results, outcomes, and that becomes your plan, really. And so you can measure this over time and see how you're getting better or getting worse.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll jump in really quickly, Brian, and I don't want to run long on this question, but I think one of the things that we have to point out as well is with both quantitative and qualitative data, sometimes it's going to be difficult to get to a one-to-one correlation. You're going to have to rely on a relationship because you can't always wring out all the different variables that lead to whether you've closed a gap on a particular issue. And so companies and organizations also have to be okay with that. You have to be okay that you won't always have a one-to-one correlation, that if you do this, this is going to be the outcome. But if you know you're getting better, there's a relationship that you have to be okay with, that you're having an impact on that. Sometimes you can't come down to some statistical and data that points right exactly to it, but darn well if you do this, you're seeing this result. You may not be able to measure it in a way that satisfies, as we joke, quant heads or people who are, want to make sure you have 0.05, statistical significance, and how we're doing it. And sometimes you have to use common sense, and that's okay. And so I think organizations have to be open to that. Some of the things that we suggest, we suggest, for an example, using ID&E nudges. So having leaders just on occasion sending out a nudge to organizations, to their organization or people in organizations to, I don't know, value diversity, or here's an example of where diversity's been really good, or I'd love to see everyone come to the talk on, ethnocentrism and privilege, right? We're not measuring those nudges, but you know what? People may take it seriously and go to those and learn and then start dropping pebbles because of it. You don't measure those downstream things, but they're having an effect, because at the end, you're going to see some positive outcomes on it that you might not be able to correlate to what you did over here, but it has a relationship to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like, we all have to learn to live in the gray. And some people are more comfortable with that than others, been my
Right.
experience.
Oh yes, we've worked with some high technical companies, and what does it, if you can't measure it, it's not good. We've heard that quite a bit.
So, what would you most want people to take away from the book?
question. I think for me, it's that people often think that it's two or three big things they need to go do in order to affect change. And the message that we have in this book is that it's the little things. And that's what we call them, the small pebbles that you drop that create these ripples. And by modeling the behavior, other people see you doing the good work, the right work, and then they're dropping pebbles. They go into the next meeting and they drop a pebble. And then the next person sees it and drops a pebble. And these pebbles create ripples, and the ripples create waves. And this is what drives change over time. And it's this daily work, right? It's toiling in the dirt too on a daily basis and doing the work. And that's how you drive change over time. It's not the two or three big flashy events that are going to make a difference, right? It's people building credibility in the organization for doing the right thing, treating people with respect and dignity, all people, and going out of your way to encourage people to speak up and to feel connected to each other, creating that kind of, and showing your values, right? So I think that's the big takeaway from the book is it's the little things, and we're going to give them to you. Here they are. And it's the little things that can take you down too. It's the obstacles that might be some little things and how to overcome those as well. So it's all about the pebbles and dropping pebbles that create ripples that can create the impact.
And the consistency of those pebbles too, right?
That's right.
Right.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I agree 100% with Jonathan. And I think the other piece of that, what I would add, a couple things that I would add is we also want people to walk away with the fact that it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And I think a lot of people don't do ID&E work or get started because they feel like it's going to take 30% of my time. It's going to take my team away from doing this or my focus away from this. It doesn't have to. In fact, if you're dropping a single pebble, once or twice a week, and you're encouraging others around you to do the same thing, and they're encouraging people, it becomes a math issue. It's just because it becomes exponentially, effective that we're all playing a part of it. So it doesn't have to be overwhelming. The last piece that I'll say to that question is, it helps everyone everywhere. So not just in the corporate space. We are talking empathy. We're talking vulnerability. We are talking having heart and an understanding for making sure that others have a voice, and here's how you do it. So it's not going to just help you in your day-to-day work life and you somehow come home and you check your daily practices at the door and you don't use them coming in. I think it makes people better humans.
I think that's
right. And I think it's super important for people to understand that the kinds of things we were talking about and the actual core underlying of ID&E is, yes, it's an effective business, amazing business tool, but truly, really, it is about making people better human beings who, if you look around us right now across the entire world, not just in the United States, we need a lot more of that. And I do honestly think people are going to walk away with some really strong understanding about the value of things as simple as being vulnerable and empathetic.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about one of the other projects that I lead called Find Your Next Calling. Both of you led careers kind of in corporate America and decided to go off on your own. And that's, a large part of what Find Your Next Calling is okay, what do I do next? I've been doing this, for X number of years. What am I really called to do in the future? So how did that happen for each of you?
Well, for me, it had been 24 years not quite 24. I would say it was 21 years in the corporate environment, driving this work, helping, people find, meaningful work. And for me, I just got to the point where I felt a combination of needing to step away from the corporate environment and allow other voices to drive almost every one of my roles. I was in a leadership role. I was the one responsible for developing the teams, building the teams, driving the strategy. And you've got to understand when you need to allow different generational voices to come into play and do that. So that was honestly a variable in my thinking. The other part of it was I was just ready to step away from some of the daily grind of back-to-back meetings, all the craziness and all reality of corporate space. And Amazon is a bias for action company, as they say. And so it's fast-paced driving, that kind of stuff. So that was a variable in it for me as well. I love to travel and spend time with family, and I've always prioritized family. So that was another variable for me. So it wasn't just one thing that had me decide to move into doing this, but I also realized, Brian, that once I retired in 2020, in June of 2020, and came out, I wasn't ready for my voice to totally be gone. I felt like there was too many things going on with all the turmoil around Black Lives Matter and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and and George Floyd and I heard from many people who were saying, what are you doing? We need your voice in this corporate space. And so I really felt that I still needed to have a voice and have a say. And I still mentor a lot of people in the companies that I belong to, again, to provide that kind of guidance to younger folks who are doing this work. So that's why I've stayed tethered to the industry in my speaking and consulting career, and spending more time influencing senior leadership teams, trying to inspire groups, and writing a book, right? And doing those kinds of things. So I think those are enough of the motivations, but that was a lot of my thinking around how I shifted gears.
Very cool. John, how about you?
Yeah, a very similar story. There's Eddie's, and that's probably why we work, so well on this to getting this book out, right? Because we both had similar goals and ambitions. I had set a goal years ago to retire from corporate life at 60, and I was able to accomplish that goal. But once I finished, I thought, it was right around the time. I mean, I left in October of 20, and I stayed longer at Amazon because of the murder of George Floyd and the others, and many, many more people that had been killed, and there was a lot of trauma in corporate America, and especially in the teams I was supporting for global teams at Amazon. The leaders needed help. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. They needed my coaching and advice. The employees were reaching out, and so I stayed there at Amazon through that summer and into the early fall. But then it was time, it was time. And in October, I decided to leave and set up my own training and consulting practice. And it was interesting because I hadn't originally planned to do that. But Eddie and I talked right when he was leaving, and I think in March to June period there, he and I talked about, like, he was setting up this consulting and training practice, and he encouraged me to do so too when I left, and that we would work together, which we made happen.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. And so we've worked closely together, but in separate companies, separate organizations. And neither of us wanted the headaches of having employees, and just wanted to keep it clean and simple and enjoy life. And so we're able to do both. I have this boutique company where I'm able to work with three companies, going deep with them. One, I'm their fractional chief diversity officer. And another, I'm guiding them through their building their whole, inclusion, diversity, and equity plan. And so it's super exciting, a lot of fun, but it's a little like being a grandparent in a way, where I feel like I'm helping them, but I'm not into the corporate bureaucracy and as we say in Yiddish, Hazarai, all the surahs of the stuff that's not so fun in companies, that I'm able to not be a part of, but still support these organizations in the work that's so important that they want to do. And yeah, I've got two grown kids, hopefully grandchildren in the near future, and I love to hike and run and exercise like Eddie, and so it gives me the opportunity to do that and travel. Yeah, it's very. I feel like I'm very grateful and very blessed for the opportunities to do what I'm doing now.
Well, having grandchildren myself, I can really understand that analogy and its application there.
Yeah, no doubt.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about discernment. It's kind of like, given, all the experience that you guys have been through, have you reflected much on the process that you use to make important decisions, what paths to take, what choices to make? How do you go about that?
Go ahead.
Sure. For me, it's interesting. I mentioned earlier at the top that I lived in the South, the deep South as a kid from ages 5 to 10. And you think, well, how could an experience you had at age 5 to 10 before I moved to Seattle when I was 10, Mercer Island, a suburb of Seattle, how could that affect your life path, right? And yet, here I was in 1993 or so, four, and a company that I was working for, a temporary help company. I was a salesman on the east side here of Seattle, and my customers were telling me that they were really struggling to diversify their workforce. And they were government contractors under affirmative action. One of them was Siemens, the one who really kicked off the idea. And they needed my help because a lot of the temp employees that they were bringing on, they were converting to full time. So I became their pipeline to their employees, staffing and leadership eventually. So they wanted my help. And so I reached out to community-based organizations to diversify the pool of candidates. And through this process and talking to my other customers, I found out that they had similar issues. And I realized there was a business issue that we needed to solve here. Again, the business of diversity. And so I put together a group with some of my customers called the East Side Diversity Task Force. And it brought together these East Side employers that were predominantly upper middle class white suburbs with Seattle's diverse population of communities,
Hmm.
ethnicities. And we met once a month and we brought together in a roundtable fashion, literally a huge roundtable fashion, hosting. Sometimes we'd host them at East Side companies. Sometimes we'd host them at the Seattle-based organizations. But using the sales knowledge I had of people getting together in person regularly to build trust, as you said earlier, and relationships and seeing what you had more in common than what you had different. All those sales skills I learned through early in my career applied to diversity recruiting. How do you build trust? It's through ongoing in-person contact and getting to know people at this deeper level. And it's been the foundation for all my work, really. And so that led to Microsoft seeing me in a diversity business newspaper with Jesse Jackson. I had an opportunity to meet him at Mount Zion Church here in Seattle and have a photo taken, which is up on my wall somewhere. And they saw that and they recruited me out to become a diversity outreach strategist for Microsoft. So it changed my life.
Hmm.
And it was from those experiences as a kid where I had this passion for diversity from those experiences I had seeing, here I was as, this kid playing Pop Warner football and going to, Little League with the parents of my friends talking about these are deep Southerners, in the South in the 60s, talking about Black people in a very negative way. And then also being teased and bullied on the playground for being Jewish. And then coming home to a home that was very liberal and open to, again, coming from Toronto and my family being Canadian and, coming into that culture, we were very different than a lot of our friends in the South, or people we knew in the South. And it changed my life. I always had that kind of pilot light burning until that customer at Siemens came to me and asked for my help. And I realized, wow, I've got some energy around this topic and I've got some ideas. And that really changed my whole life and my path.
Wow. That's very cool. Very cool. How about you,
And
buddy?
yeah, so I'll answer it slightly differently. Um, I think for me, the discernment part in the different paths that I took, um, and I'll stick to the ID&E portion of my life, right? There was definitely an athletic background that, because of some significant knee injuries, really took me into a different path than I really fully expected to be going as a football player way back when. Um, and then as it started getting towards having to make decisions and decide what paths to go on, quite honestly, Brian, it came down to I never wanted to do anything that wasn't meaningful.
Hmm.
I didn't want to do things that I couldn't truly have an impact on people's lives. In fact, when I was just finishing up my doctorate at the University of Washington in sociology, I had this moment where I could go towards the social work academia path, or I could go towards the corporate point. And I literally, in that moment, had an epiphany that I really didn't want to, at that moment, be a professor, even though there's no knock on academia, on professors and that kind of thing. but that I really wanted to go someplace where I could almost instantly have an impact on people's lives. And that really was the direction that I took. And honestly, other things that affected my path in terms of what companies I chose and what I did in roles, I wanted global experiences. And Jonathan's, a lot of his career had some amazing, wonderful global experiences. And I think he'd tell you the same, that that really adds an incredible amount of satisfaction and knowledge and experiences when you can be global. So that for me was a piece of the discernment, right? And then the final one that has guided every choice I think I've made, and I can truthfully and honestly say that my family was a priority, period, in the story. And I always put priority on my family. And then you have this notion as you start getting older, you want to be able to in conjunction with your partner, support your family and help your family. So for me and Val, it's like, how do we both contribute so we can give our kids experiences on a global basis and the things that we think are important and push them into, having vulnerability and heart and do those kinds of things. So for me, those were the discernment points, and there were the non-negotiable pieces for me. It had to be meaningful, had to be impactful, had to be global, and I had to make sure that my family was first, and that was always going to be the case. Period. So I think that's kind of how I would think about those inflection points and the directions you took, and I feel really pretty good that I stuck to those guiding principles for myself, and those values were important to me, and I've left a couple roles when there was a misalignment because of new leadership. And people will tell you, you don't leave companies, you leave bad managers. And if you don't feel like you can have the kind of impact that you need to have, and it's not meaningful because of some type of poor leadership, that becomes a path that you divert to, right? So
Totally agree. That's been my experience as well. Well, one of the things I liked about both of your examples, even though stories were quite different, in both cases, you had something that you saw that was a need that you were passionate about addressing, coupled with an ability to do something about it.
right.
And when I, talk to people about finding your next calling, I'm very, asking them to look for those two things. Is there a need out there somewhere that you're really passionate about serving? And it's something that you can do something about. Like trying to solve
Right.
world hunger would be a little bit tough for any of us as individuals. But, there are a lot of things that maybe are surprisingly, in some cases, within our sphere of influence, right, that we
Right.
can do something about.
Right.
So I'm glad to see that those elements came out in both of what you said.
Right. I love that. And something that brings to mind just very quickly is there was a book by Gunnar Myrdal called An American Dilemma. And one of the things that you're talking about here is it sounds like what drove you and what definitely I know drove Jonathan and definitely drove me is that I'd wake up every day with a dilemma that things aren't how they should be. And that I wonder what I can do within my sphere of influence. I might not be able to solve world hunger, but I could wake up with a dilemma that people are hungry, that people don't have this. And so what is it that I'm going to do for that? And you can't solve everything and have a dilemma, but you need to, I argue, wake up and have a dilemma about something that really drives what's really meaningful to you and do something. Rock that boat. Go do it. Drop a pebble. Do whatever you need to do. So I like the notion of having a dilemma, and that if we wake up every day and you don't have a dilemma about something, you probably are missing the boat, in my opinion.
Amen. Amen. So, what advice would each of you want to give folks that are kind of considering, maybe jumping, the corporate ship, so to speak, and, going off on their own or whatever it is that they, have been embedded in to go do something much different?
Hmm. I don't want to be cliche, but this idea of, following your passion. And I think part of the challenge is finding your passion for a lot of folks, finding the thing that is going to really be meaningful, as Eddie said, and impactful. Um, that's the tough thing for folks. And when it comes your way and you see it and you get excited about it, and maybe it's the paycheck isn't the same. Like I took a pay cut to go to Microsoft, if you can believe it. I mean, yeah, I literally, had to do the math it was kind of funny. A quick story is like, I think I was making like 75,000 a year in sales or whatever. And Microsoft's salary was like 55. And I was taking a cut to go to Microsoft. This is back in 95, right? And they offered me, I figured, well, if the stock can grow at least 10% a year, then I'll be okay. I ended up staying there 19 years and I made the move not because of the money. I made the move because I was going into an area that I was passionate about and I had, talent to go do. I knew I could do it and I knew I could be successful. So I didn't worry about the money. And I think so often people will turn down something because of, a factor that really isn't that important in the long run. If you're doing the work that you love to do and you're passionate about it and it's impactful, the gifts will come back to you. The opportunities will come your way because you're
Absolutely.
doing good work, you're making an impact, and the rest will take care of itself. You can't worry about that. Just find your passion and you'll be happy and you'll have more energy than you know what to do with. I know that's for me. When I'm working on something I'm passionate about, I have like unlimited energy. Like this book. I mean, Eddie and he's probably sick and tired of me sending him notes and things about all the things we could do and done. And it's because I'm passionate about it, I'm excited about it. And so I've got this energy that I can't get rid of. And so that's it, I think, for me. Eddie, what do you think?
So, and I'll go, well stated, and I agree 100%. And I think I'll go a practical route for you, Brian. I think something that I mentor a lot of people, and one of the things, and I have a lot of people who come to me like, okay, you've done this work for so long. What should I do if I'm thinking about getting to this, or I'm thinking actually about leaving it? I often point people to an article called 50 Cups of Coffee. And what I tell people is you may not have 50 cups of coffee, but the whole idea behind it is you could find different people in different parts of industries that you may be interested in, different types of roles, and go have 50 cups of coffee with 50 different people
Mm.
and just have conversations with them and network, ask questions, get other referrals. And I talk to people who are thinking about transitioning out of corporate to start their own businesses or different roles within I think any person who's looking at either forcing a change that they are making or they're forced into making a change because of layoffs or changes or, work becomes untenable because of a new boss or whatever, 50 cups of coffee.
Mm.
Go have conversations with people because I think we often don't really understand what I can do, in this space or something. Someone will say, what, diversity work, what can you do with it? And then, I have a learning background. I'm a teacher. And I'm like, do you realize there are learning and development teams at companies that you can go and get a role and integrate ID&E into how you do that? And you're not on a diversity team. And they're going, oh. And so how do you know that? 50 cups of coffee. Don't talk to people.
Well, there's so much of the world that none of us see, right? Because we're only
Yes.
exposed to, our own little
Yes.
part of the world, the bubble that
Just like
we
that.
live in, whatever that bubble is. And so I think I
Correct.
love that. I'm going to look for that article and share it with
Good.
people. So I appreciate
Good.
that. Thank you. So guys, I really appreciate you spending time to do this. I love your perspective on things. I really think that your book is important and I really hope that it does well. Again, the title is Daily Practices of Inclusive Leaders, a guide to building a culture of belonging. And you can learn more about it at inclusivepebbles.com. So guys, thanks again very much and best wishes on all your work.
Brian, thank you. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.